in case to confirm that you're in the right room, this is the panel on AI, what should have been mis and disinformation and elections in conflict-affected contexts. This issue, of course, has received quite a lot of attention, even this morning, for those who are following their new convictions around the January 6th attack. It's also received a lot of attention in our space, not only for how social media tends to exacerbate existing risks, but how it presents new risks that were previously unforeseen. We at Interpiece are quite new in programming in this area. We've come to it because we've seen the effects in our programming in Kenya, in DRC, and elsewhere, and it's something that we really want to better understand. And we know that there's a lot of very important work that's already going on in this space at the cross-section of the tech community and the peace-building community. To just mention a few of those, there's of course the Network on Tech and Social Cohesion, which was launched earlier this year. There's also an excellent volume, for those who haven't seen it, edited by Lisa and all the authors that contributed to this. I've been bringing it around and trying to encourage as many people as possible to read it who haven't seen it yet. And there's also the really important work that have been done by partners such as the Kofi Annan Foundation, of which Sebastian was part, if he's able to join us today. Similarly, in the policy climate, there are meetings such as just yesterday. I'm sure many of you have seen the visit of tech executives with the vice president here in DC to talk about the growing nature of the risks. I think that's one of the challenges that we've seen as we've tried to bring these two communities together for discussions and deliberations around important issues such as this, that as the technology develops so quickly, it's very difficult to keep up with the nature and the extent of the risks as well as the opportunities. So in the framing of seeing this as a problem-solving session, as a session where we really want to save a lot of time for discussion, to pose questions to all of you, to solicit ideas, to hear your thinking. If you're working on this, what areas and what angles you're working on it from. We at Interpiece wanted to put together a panel of experts who have really been doing a lot of thinking in this space so that we can learn from them and learn from all of you. So on the panel today, to just briefly introduce each of our speakers, I will wait to introduce Sebastian if he's able to join us, but just to say in brief, he led the Kofi Annan Foundation's work around election integrity and democracy, and is currently also their advisor to the European Union. In addition to Sebastian, we have Eleonora here with us. Her full bio is on your app, but just to say she's the head of anticipatory action and innovation at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research in New York. She has a PhD in machine learning techniques for political deliberation, and she's worked as a data scientist and researcher at the United Nations for over a decade. In addition to Eleanor, we are also very lucky to have with us Claire, whose partnership on AI's head of AI and media integrity of their media and integrity program. And under Claire's leadership, the AI and media integrity team creates best practices for the development and deployment of AI technologies that impact digital media and online information. And then fourth, joining us online, just above my head, we have Ivy, who is a former colleague of mine at Interpiece, and she is now at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And she'll speak to her own experience in one critical election context that Sebastian was also going to comment on, which is that of Kenya in both 2007 and 2017, to offer her own personal reflections on how the online content affected conversations amongst her community and peer groups. Ivy, as I mentioned, is a former colleague from Interpiece, but she's conducted extensive research monitoring social media activities and on Kenya's political history, and particularly around the 2007 post-election humanitarian emergency situation. So without further ado, we would have gone to Sebastian first to talk through the links between social media and election violence in the conflict-related context that they've worked in, and how those effects can be anticipated and mitigated. Perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion section. I can share some thoughts, my own personal thoughts and Interpiece's experience with that. But instead, we're going to pass to Eleanor first. And Eleanor, jumping straight in to the technology side, I think it would be really helpful if you could tell us more about the technology behind social media at present, particularly in these contexts of fraught elections. What are examples of existing algorithms that might further polarization? or discrimination in the context of elections? And how might these play out in different conflict-affected countries? And then on the flip side, what sort of technology or algorithms might help encourage trust or social cohesion? For those who were here for the keynote this morning, I'm sure you heard discussions in terms of another means and venues for encouraging social cohesion through the work that Sesame Street has done with their own programming. So over to you, Eleanor, to kick off the conversation and to set the tone for us in terms of what technology has offered.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. So I'm Eleanor Fournier-Toombs. I'm a data scientist who, over the last few years, I've become increasingly interested in data science policy. I know I'm not the only one. Having worked on developing various tools over time, I really started feeling that it would be really important to contribute to the discussions right now around policy, ethics, and regulations of this field. And I had a presentation, but I'm not going to show it, so I'm just scrambling to put together my notes. I think the context of what I want to talk about and to respond to Rebecca's question is really to try to make the link between the global conversations that are taking place around AI regulation and social media. In a lot of conversations that I've had with peacebuilding experts and policy experts, the question that comes up is, how is what's happening on social media in particular related to polarization and misinformation? How is that related to the global conversation on AI? And so in this context, we have right now at the UN a new framework and recommendation on the ethics of AI that came out in 2021. We had the European Union in April 2021, which was a first mover in regulating high-risk uses of AI. They didn't really touch on the conflict angle. And so I've just, for this short discussion, I'm just bringing forward kind of three types of uses of AI techniques or tools that come out in social media and that would be relevant in this context. The first one, and I know we're all very familiar with social media too. So, but the first one would be the ranking algorithms and recommendation systems. So as we all know, each social media platform uses a different way to promote content and to suggest content, whether it's on people's individual pages or in the case of certain social media platforms like Twitter, there will be trending pages as well, where content is suggested. Those recommendation systems use a combination of understanding what the individual profile of the user would be, what people with their profile would be most likely to click on, and what is most popular at any given time. The structure of these algorithms are kind of similar to other kinds of recommendation systems that we see on the internet. So, for example, a lot of us probably use Netflix. We have recommendation algorithms on there. Some of the platforms use more personalized recommendations, and other ones tend to do more generalized ones. So, like Twitter will have a combination of both, where TikTok will have a lot of kind of more general recommendations as well. So that is a consideration for conflict because, as we know, these kinds of algorithms really benefit a lot or are impacted a lot by interaction with content. And as human beings, we all have a tendency to interact more with polarizing content and shock value content. During the pandemic, we've seen that there's been an increase in online hate speech, particularly violence against women online has increased. And some of the research that I've conducted in the past, in particular with UN Women, has shown that even people that disagreed with the content, misogynistic or conflict-inducing content, would still interact with it because they were surprised by it. So might like it, might repost it, or might even save the content, all of which those types of actions would contribute to it being recommended and furthered. In the context that Rebecca spoke about, there's certain types of ways in which we saw particularly use of social media for the spread of disinformation. In Côte d'Ivoire, for example, there was an incident where fake news around violence was propagating, which then led to actual real-life violence by people that were outraged by this false information. In DRC, there's been a lot of misinformation and disinformation around health and humanitarian interventions, making interventions around Ebola and now COVID-19 and humanitarian aid much more difficult. In Kenya, there was a lot of disinformation and targeted disinformation campaigns linked to the Pandora Papers and corruption and offshore accounts in the Kenyan government. So those are just examples of how this disinformation was spread. And finally, what I want to talk about is a kind of AI algorithm that is becoming extremely current and which we've all heard a lot about. We hadn't heard a lot about it potentially a year ago, but as of now, I think everybody has a sense of ChatGPT, generative AI, those kinds of algorithms. And probably most of you have tried it at home. So there's three types of content typically that will be generated. It'll be text-based, image-based, and video-based. And this definitely is of concern, I think, for people working in this field, how easy it is to generate misinformation, disinformation content in using these tools. And so using, for example, a text-based generative AI system, you can, and people are starting to write some prompts explaining the kind of disinformation campaign that they would like to conduct, can connect these tools to a chatbot or provide information to influencers that they might want to intentionally conduct these campaigns. And so the spread and the rapidity and even the convincingness of the content has really increased even in the last few months. In the research I've done in the past on gender, there's been a lot of concerns as well in terms of spreading and targeting disinformation related to specific women, such as human rights defenders and peace builders. We did a study in Southeast Asia where a lot of individual women were being targeted, and they were being targeted namely through the doctoring of images and deepfake videos, which would attack their reputation by presenting them in sexually compromising positions. And so now that making fake videos is even more easier than before, this is certainly also a concern. So just to close on this, what are some of the paths forward for these issues? So clearly, I think that there's going to need to be more of a global framework to fight disinformation online. Social media companies, of course, are individually dealing with this a little bit. In many cases, we find it to be not enough. We find that the methodologies of augmented fighting of disinformation, whether it's using individual content monitoring and aided by different AI tools, is not enough. It would be great to have a more harmonized and global approach for these issues. Of course, we all know that it's not only social media companies involved here too. Many national governments are actively involved in using these tools to propagate disinformation, and that's why a global framework would probably be quite helpful. Additionally, I think we need to look at develop clearer linkages between AI regulations and the fight against misinformation. right now they seem to be developing kind of in separate silos, and it would be really great to bring the conversation together. And then in relation to this conversation, potentially really point out the vulnerability around of these tools around elections, and have a much more targeted approach to monitoring around elections. I think much more effort and capacity has to be deployed globally, especially now that we have such powerful tools to foster misinformation and disinformation. So I'll stop there, but happy to continue the conversation. Oh.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thanks for laying out those typologies, those three categories, and then beginning to make suggestions of where the conversation could go next in terms of global regulatory frameworks. Claire, I wonder if you could continue in that vein. I mean, Eleanor's discussed a few examples, but if you could give us a few more examples of the technology to just put that on the table for discussion afterwards. And in addition to that, it would also be really helpful to hear more, because I know you've done work in this space on particularly how this technology could be managed by local organizations who might not have the same resources or reach as, say, the United Nations, especially, for example, local newsrooms. You know, you've done work in that space. And then just given the nature of PeaceCon and those who are here today, if you could say a little bit about what the peace-building community in particular might be able to offer in terms of contributing their expertise and their efforts to the design of this tech, because I think there's sometimes reticence because of the amount of learning and the time it takes to become conversant in it. So it'd be really useful to hear from you on those 3 points.
And thank you, Rebecca, for having me. And Eleanor, it's such a privilege to go after someone who laid out that kind of really nice structure around these technologies. And I'm newish to the peace building realm, so thanks to all of you for teaching me a lot. And I'll start by describing a bit about the aperture with which I approach the AI in society challenge, and then answer your questions as best I can. So I've worked at the Partnership on AI since the organization began over 5 years ago, though I'm a cognitive scientist and computer scientist by training. And PAI is a global multi-stakeholder nonprofit devoted to the seemingly Sisyphean mandate of responsible development and deployment of AI. And our origin story, I think, is a testament to how we do our work. We were founded by the heads of AI research at most of the largest companies, so Facebook, Apple, Amazon, DeepMind, IBM, Microsoft, and Google, who grew up together as computer scientists going to the same conferences, but realized that the societal impact of the technology transcended any one technology company, and not just the tech sector, but transcends sectors too. So we became a partnership, per the name, of over 100 institutions from around the world, from civil society, academia, industry, so other prongs of industry, and media and journalism. And I say you can make a case for any institution presumably caring about the impact of these technologies on their societal area. And we convene that group, and it's nice to be amidst folks who understand the value of multi-stakeholderism and convening, not only to build community and knowledge, but also to inform frameworks and processes that should not supplant regulation as a really important tool, but are a way to work more swiftly and be derived from kind of a set of equities and values that might not just be that of one government or one technology company who's often making decisions about how this technology works. And the program area I lead, as Rebecca introduced, is predicated on a huge question again, which is how we have a healthy information ecosystem in the AI age. And for the past 4.5 years, we've done work identified by our community, funneled from this belief that AI is impacting democracy, privacy, conflict, and all of those values that were articulated in our mandate, that questions of AI-generated content warrant multi-stakeholder collaboration. And I will, hammer home this point that it's not just the AI field teaching the peace and conflict field, but there's a lot from this domain that should go back into the AI governance models, which I'll talk about in a second. So a little over 4 years ago, just to illustrate this, we worked very closely with Witness, a video and human rights nonprofit that has done enormous work alongside us and a lot of the technology companies, basically asking how do we defend the truth and freedom of expression globally, which is, of course, a major input into resolving conflict and resolving tension around the world. And we used to take an approach that was prepare, don't panic, that these tools are not super sophisticated, they're not super accessible. We hosted a workshop around AI-generated misinformation the week before a video of Nancy Pelosi in the US went viral that had no sophisticated AI manipulation. It was merely slowed down. So of course, this problem being an existing one, but as Eleanor was pointing out, the methods for being able to just doctor or create an artificial image is just so much easier and more photorealistic right now, which presents, I'd say, we've moved from prepare, don't panic to don't fearmonger, but perhaps take it more seriously. And through our work, a few themes have emerged. And this year, some of this is informed. We spent over a year working on something. I'm terrible at shameless plugs, but synthetic media partnershiponai.org, basically a set of recommendations for how to responsibly build, create, and distribute synthetic material. And we launched that with 10 institutions, including Witness, Bumble, which is a dating app, which you wouldn't think is thinking about this, but the non-consensual use of women's imagery, of course, comes up for them. OpenAI, of course, building the technologies that might be used by someone to cast doubt on reality. TikTok distributing and, the algorithms interfacing with, we have AI building and generating the content, and then we have AI interacting with that to distribute it. The BBC and the CBC from journalism, and then 3 synthetic media startups and Adobe. And within that, several values emerge around watermarking, disclosure. How do we actually give audiences the power to understand where content comes from? And just, a really meaningful example, I think in March, there was an instance in which people were showing photos of fake historic events. There was this fake earthquake going viral, and people were making up these histories. I think they called it Great Cascadia, and people were creating all this storytelling, which I think if you just extrapolate to a conflict zone, people creating false narratives with a flood of volume of material, that's really scary. So in our framework, there's attempts to break this kind of down between the values need to be global around what we care about, but the practices for responsibility might vary if you're OpenAI, if you're TikTok, or if you are a media organization. And just to show the one point that's really interesting is how do we navigate dual use? Because for conflict, it's very visceral to understand this, if take any geography in which someone could cast doubt on what's happening. And, actually our colleagues at Witness, I'm going to keep plugging their work, just hosted a convening in Africa where they brought together advocates, journalists to kind of create images on Midjourney, which is a image generator software of protests, of, activity like that, and how to really get a sense of how the technology is used. And there's a belief that we need to not only have media literacy in terms of just an awareness, but also what are the tools that can help us understand and amplify that literacy. So there are moves to have transparency, disclosure that content is AI generated. How do we ensure the platforms enact that? And we are trying to work at the policy momentum in order to do that. So several themes, and then to the journalism and final question, because I think it'll be more lively for us to be in dialogue. And I'm so curious to hear what Ivy, who has more illustrative examples, has to say. One aspect is that generative AI gets touted as this kind of big beast, and it's very trendy, but I actually think the modality matters. We were very intentional to think about mechanisms for mitigating the impact of audiovisual content that might be different but related to those for text. So it's really important to have these global threat models that are attentive not only to the modality of the material that's influencing things, but also the region in which it's being deployed. To my point about dual use, I also say there are positive uses of this technology. So we hear a lot about misinformation, but journalists, the BBC, used deepfake technology to obfuscate the faces of Hong Kong protesters and more truthfully report and empower those individuals to tell a story. So how do we reconcile this dual use by creating technologies and social structures that enable that to coexist? Of course, it's become clear that there needs to be a global attention to this. There is a lot of folks in Silicon Valley thinking about the development of technology without context-specific sensitivity, and that's why actually we think AI could be a really meaningful mechanism for empowering local storytellers, journalists who are perhaps cash-constrained or resource-constrained to use some of these technologies. So with the Knight Foundation, we've been doing work on AI in local news to help kind of cash-strapped local newsrooms who are concerned with even just, we can't be in the local town hall to scrape minutes. How can we maybe use this technology to speak truth to power in a more effective, responsible, and cost-saving way? And then the last thing I'll say is there's been a very strong movement in the AI governance field to ask a question that might resonate with all of you. And there's this question of how do we aggregate, understand, and incorporate the conflicting values of overlapping groups of people when making decisions about AI governance. So how can it not just be a cohort of engineers sitting in Palo Alto, but who strive to hear from the community, but are also, I have some empathy for their inability to talk to the whole world. What are these governance methods that might navigate conflict resolution? And that's where I think, I wish they were talking more, and I'm encouraged to talk to the peacebuilding movement. There's been a lot of deliberative democracy pushes within the AI field out of this recognition that conflict and value resolution is actually at the heart of dictating the trajectory of how AI develops. So I'm really keen to talk about that kind of inverse idea of not just your field thinking about AI literacy, but the AI field thinking about conflict and peace resolution literacy as well.
Thank you so much, Claire, for that presentation and for raising those questions. And I hope that gives the room some time to begin to reflect on particularly that last one while we listen to Ivy. Transferring to Ivy, thumbs up if you've been able to hear us okay throughout the first few. Wonderful. In terms of audio, to unmute Ivy, I look at the A for B powers that be here. Ivy, can we check the sounds?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Wonderful. You're coming through loud and clear.
I just had to unmute myself, apparently.
Thank you. Wonderful when things are simpler than expected in terms of tech. So Ivy, I think it would be really wonderful to round out the beginning of this conversation with the room. And sorry, I assume you can hear us. I'm down here. Of what your experience has been engaging in social media during the 2007 and 2017 critical elections in Kenya. It would be helpful to better understand how the conversations on and offline compared amongst your immediate peer group, the broader community, how you saw the national conversation going, to help us understand where people went for authoritative and trusted information, and then what spaces existed at the time in those critical moments to speak across differences in opinion or differences in politics, and how those might have changed between those two critical election moments. And just more broadly, how you see the use of social media in Kenya contributing to or fighting against efforts to polarize groups in those critical moments. And I know broadly so many really innovative and trailblazing efforts have been taken within Kenya. So we're really grateful to have you here to share your perspective on it. Though I know we have limited time, so to begin the conversation, and we can always branch out to some of those other initiatives. So over to you, Ivy, for your thoughts.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. It's been such a pleasure listening to you and to Eleanor and Claire too. Learning a lot too. And I'm also relating some of the things Eleanor and Claire have mentioned for the Kenyan context. And so in general, just from my own experience, so for context, I am Kenyan, born, bred in Kenya. I am now in Geneva. So more looking at it also from a diaspora context. But in Kenya, I will say over the last few years or over the last decade, there has been an increase of social media use. And so we can see a difference in the 2007 elections and say the 2017 or the 2022 elections. in the 2007 elections, which of course led to the post-election violence, where like more than 1,500 people lost their lives, and there were quite a lot of displacements. Social media was not as developed, and so many people relied on traditional media, so radios and televisions. I was at home with my parents, watching TV, and of course listening to the chaos going on in the outside world. So that was the main thing going on, and I know that even for the election violence, what was confirmed after is it was mostly instigated. The hate speech and the ethnic polarization was mostly instigated by radio journalists, which of course the case led to go to the ICC, so the criminal court. But as the years progressed, so 2017 and 2022 elections, we saw a huge, there was an increase of the use of social media, which Kenya is now in Africa among the top 10 countries, which of course including South Africa, Nigeria or Morocco. So there's a huge use of social media over the past few years. And also this is to take into account that almost 70% of the population in Kenya are under 35. So this also is just to show that the largest population that is using this social media is, of course, young people. And so we can see a difference in the sense of even right now, the youth, they will rather use social media. So there's a WhatsApp, people share a lot of messages on WhatsApp, but also Facebook and Twitter. And Kenya now has a community on Twitter, and they call themselves the KOT. So Kenyans on Twitter, very simple, which like it's very easy to access information even from me from here. Like during elections, I can easily follow what is going on with the trends, and also with, of course, the photos being shared, not only from citizens themselves in what, of course, is referred to as citizen journalism, but also from the traditional media, who now also have their pages and their accounts on social media. But also today we see there's quite a lot of political engagement on social media with the politicians themselves, whether it is them behind these accounts or them having hired like social media managers to engage with the communities, to educate, and of course to just inform public opinion. And so there's been side which is, of course, has been very positive. There's been a lot of sharing, which does also in this situation we have to bring into account what has been mentioned. There is a lot of information which is sometimes without context, without having been fact checked. So quite a lot of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. So and yeah, just this chaotic nature, which brings me to the question of the translation between what is going on online and what is happening offline. Sometimes there's a loss of translation in the sense of social media. There'll be quite a lot of people using social media, engaging, sharing, also putting out whether it's hate speech or ethnic polarization, because in Kenya over the last few years now it's beginning to reduce, but there's huge, like ethnicity is a huge factor in politics. So there has been ethnic polarization, which means one person from one tribe will incite people probably using his own mother tongue, and which might easily then lead to violence that you see on the streets, and then the displacements and the general violence that happens. And so this side of, there's a lot of sharing online and now engagements. The youth are talking about voting, what can be done, elections, but we can also see that young people are the ones that vote the least in Kenya. So as much as there's this side of we are engaging, we are talking, we are learning more. You don't have to have a TV, or you don't have to go outside and buy a radio. You can have all this information on your smartphone. still there's a huge, there's less trust in the government, or there's still the problems of unemployment, of economic hardship. And even my friends and my peers would always, when you have conversations with them, what comes out is, if you trust in the government as a young person, you'll be disappointed for life. So I think this is also one of the reasons why there's reticence in actually going out and voting and actually being positive. But if not, yes, as I said, now in Kenya, especially in 2007, some people developed an app. It's called Ushahidi, which means witness in Swahili. And this allows, it's a crowdsourcing application where citizens from different locations can come and actually fill in information to report. So it's a way of also verifying information of what is happening in social media. The people in different parts of the country can actually go into this site and verify, yes, this is happening, no, this is not happening. And so it's a very good way to actually, especially during elections, there's so much going on. So it's one of the good ways and one of the apps that have been developed to just streamline the information and the amount of information coming out. So yes, so there's this side for sure, and in Kenya now, of course, social media is being used negatively, but I would want to put out that it is also being used as a peace building tool. So we are seeing now, of course, their careers in social media influencing. So they're either being paid by the government, so they're getting contracts with the government to preach peace, to educate people. And these are just not only the social media influencers, but actors and celebrities, and of course, the people themselves, or just because over like in 2007 and 2017 and in the past years, there's been a history of violence in Kenya, and people have lost a lot of lives, their relatives lost their belongings, been displaced. And so just for the sake of not repeating the same experiences or not going through the same things, so yeah, this peace coming from the citizens themselves, which is facilitated by social media, because information can definitely reach everyone quickly. And yes, so that's it. And maybe just to finish, I will say like some of the measures that on top of the peace building tool and on top of the influencers and people preaching peace, we could always, as ourselves as young people or the people themselves using social media, try to verify information before sharing it to the general public, because to avoid this misinformation and disinformation propagating during elections, which cause violence, but also share positive content, as Eleanor mentioned, I think, about the algorithms, which tend to push negative, like negativity a lot. So I think by sharing also positive content, it will also help in a sense to push, the peace building agenda. So yeah, that is my experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivy. To transition from these initial presentations, I know we have about half an hour left, and I'm sure you have questions for the room, issues you want to engage further on. I have a few questions for all of you as well, so I'm just going to briefly ask you, the room, 3 questions, and then please either feel free to address questions for the panelists or to respond to any of these. But I'm curious, in terms of your own work as peace builders, as researchers, or as practitioners, how you see the risk level increasing or decreasing based on differing degrees of access to social media within the context, within the places where you work. And then to build on what's been discussed before, I'm curious in terms of how you think that AI could be deployed more effectively at these critical moments that we've been looking at. And then, given that resources are scarce and that it takes quite a while to understand the technology, particularly given how quickly it's moving, how do you think that civil society organizations, particularly local civil society organizations, can be given the support the skills, the access, in order to better combat the risks when capacity is limited. So I'll leave just those questions out with the room, with all of you, but over to you, and I have a few questions for the panelists, which I'll come back to, but just to open up the floor, does anyone want to jump in either with answers to those questions or questions for our panelists? Please, just here.
I would say something that I've seen in Devin Branson, Sites of Conscience. One of the things that we've seen that's been, I think, a real weakness in what regulation has been implemented in terms of misinformation and hate speech is that it's largely English language based, and there is not a lot of nuance in like more contextual colloquial speech and how that's regulated. I think both Twitter and Facebook have really struggled with trying to regulate non-English content. I'm not sure if any of the panelists are aware of regulations or efforts to strengthen that. And then another challenge, while not AI or artificial intelligence, an area that I think is really hard to kind of access are misinformation that's transmitted via WhatsApp groups and encrypted messaging services, where an algorithm can't regulate what's in there, but the information that's transferred in there leads to a lot of, we've seen in India, I think, has had a lot of rumors spread via WhatsApp groups and has led to actual violence in communities, and addressing that is something that we've struggled to really know how to even start to regulate that.
Thank you for bringing those in the space. Please.
I've done some work with preventing and countering violent extremism in Africa, and I did an assessment in the southeastern part of Senegal, which borders Mali, and we found that people were targeted via social media in that area specifically much more than the rest of the country. And so it was one of the things that prompted the assessment, that there was an initial study that looked at targeting of people, and they found that there was more targeting there, and that it led to, well, it had some effect on people's attitudes and anti-government attitudes and willingness to take up arms and willingness to participate in violence to defend whatever their grievances are. So I don't have a huge view on that, but it's happening, I know, in the VE space quite a bit. Yeah.
Thank you. And just for the room, is it possible to introduce yourself and
sure.
your affiliation?
Jessup, I'm a consultant mostly on USAID projects.
Thank you so much, Maria. Anyone else from please?
My name is Tiffany Tang. I'm new to the space. I've actually been in Silicon Valley for the last 15 years, mostly on the fintech side. This is all deeply personal.
You can stand up. It's hard to hear.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Tiffany.
That's fine.
But
My name is Tiffany. I'm new to the space. I've been in software in Silicon Valley for the last 15 years. But this topic is deeply personal to me because members of my immediate family were basically radicalized by QAnon stuff that they saw on WhatsApp and other places. So one of my questions is how much of the misinformation and disinformation is from state actors versus just individuals? That would be super helpful even to get a ballpark sense of where it's coming from. And then I think my second question is, once someone, and maybe this is more for the conflict space, once someone is radicalized, like how do you radicalize them if they're still ingesting information? I mean, short of literally taking away their phone, which feels like an infringement on rights, but I was ready to, like, website redirects, all kinds of crazy things. So that's my question to both the group and to you guys.
thank you, Tiffany. Please.
Hi everyone, I'm Leslie Martin. I work at Chronix. Something that I have really grappled with, not just in this space and with Peacebuilding, but also with democratic backsliding has been, and with violent extremism and specific targeting, of this very thorny issue of scale. And that with languages, that it's not just happening in the US, it's happening everywhere. and to get at these individual experiences of radicalization, of targeting, of misinformation on vaccines or health access through different closed channels like WhatsApp or Telegram, that some of the most effective treatment or kind of interventions have been at the very individual level of having people who've experienced that radicalization, who have come back from the breach, to then reach out individually. It's very difficult to scale that, though, when you have clearly a man-made tech issue to then get at it from a very human connection. Is very difficult. There have been some great strides in using, especially in totalitarian environments where you have highly close internet access, of using available marketing platforms, of using banner ads, of using, maybe it's a commercial that seems like it's selling you Tide, but really it's trying to get you to think about the war in Ukraine. And there's a couple of US-based organizations. They used to be called Main Street One, and they used to be involved in democratic politics, and they've really moved into the space of countering violent extremism. They've worked with people who were former ISIS fighters, rehabilitation. So there are really kind of small organizations that are doing this, but you don't quite have the scalability again, because the problem is only seemingly going to expand. And so a question I've been asking myself of how do we get to the supply side of things? Like, how do you target the individuals perhaps creating the content, spreading it? How do you change the behavior, not necessarily on the receiving side, but on the source of the material to start with?
Thank you, Leslie. We've got two more. Sorry, I saw you first, and then I'll come to you.
Sure. Hi, my name is Lily Goldberg. I work for FHI 360. I think it's not necessarily a question, just something that I feel like we should grapple with and think about a little bit more, which is the burden that we're putting on very small organizations around the world to pick this up. And, I say that, so we're working with a couple of just intensely talented, amazing organizations in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Thailand who are working on this issue, who are trying to develop and utilize artificial intelligence to monitor dangerous speech in multiple languages. These are organizations that are based in all the countries. And the one thing that I, as not an AI literate person, but trying to kind of really deeply understand is the amount of resources it takes to create data sets in languages that aren't, that don't have a ton of information and resources out there, and research. I mean, this takes an amazing amount of data, which takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. And I'm sure, maybe as the technology evolves, that window will shorten. But, at the end of the day, when you look at governments who have an amazing amount of resources, weaponizing information, you have billion-dollar companies that can't even figure this out. I mean, what are we asking organizations to do with $100,000 grants? I mean, let's be realistic about this, right? So I just want us as a community to really think about what we're asking small organizations to do, the burden that we're putting on them to clean this all up, and how we can reimagine our approach to this, because I just don't think that's fair. And I think while the Trusted Partner Network and program is one that is it exists, and I don't want to speak ill of it, but I think that is also a very exploitative model. So I don't know. I think this is just something that we need to really think about when we're thinking about the position of the community organizing and what we're asking them to do with very little resources. And I think we're also asking them to do work that is really detrimental to their mental health, as we know as well. So yeah, it's not a question, it's more just a comment.
comments are very welcome. Discussions are richer then. So please, thanks for your patience.
Will Ferrajaro, a consultant, done a lot of work on hate speech, disinformation, COVID-19, misinformation. To kind of Lily's point, I think I thought I'd relate both some work that I've done at Mercy Corps, both in terms of putting forward a framework that might be useful to people here. We produced an applied framework that looked at the role of social media on existing conflict drivers within countries. So it's not to say specifically misinformation or disinformation, but it's to say that these phenomena exist on top of underlying fault lines, right? And so we came up with a way to think about this, and I suggest that refer you to that first as a way to think about programming in countries. And to Lily's point, we did some work around in Kenya around the elections, and your colleague from Interpeace made a really good point about the positives and negatives of social media. To another person's comment here about the scope and scale of all of this being such a problem, we had a country team in place already doing programming. We had enough funds to engage both a very local group to do kind of peace messaging, even very low threshold, with phones and call-ins and so on, but also other groups to kind of mobilize influencers as well. But more importantly, to kind of to answer a number of your concerns, there was kind of a multi-pronged effort. It wasn't just what we were doing. There were plenty of other groups in the country working on this, as well as the government, both at national and county levels. And so I just offer that as an example of that's probably the best case scenario, because Kenya's had to deal with this, as our colleague said, online, since 2007, in dealing with media and social media in elections. So it's kind of been, in a way, innovative to look at how to respond to this sort of thing. So anyway, I just want to refer to the framework and then agree with all of you that it's a multifaceted, complex, overscale sort of problem that needs multi-pronged response. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Will. Do we have one more question or comment before I go back to the panel?
Hi, I'm Syra Zaidi. I work at the Carter Center, which in recent years has started a digital threats to democracy program. And I was recently in Pakistan talking to an organization that's working on combating mis and disinformation there. We're discussing sort of the social media landscape in Pakistan. And one thing that was really interesting is we've seen a lot of discussions recently about TikTok in the US, in the hearings and all of that. And, I sort of have this thought that maybe some of that at least is rooted in geopolitics and the US-China relationship and that focus, and maybe it's being unfairly targeted in some ways. But what was interesting there is that they said in Pakistan, TikTok is the social media platform with the least transparency and the one that worries them the most, and is growing the most. And I think one of you, I think Eleanor said, that there needs to be more global harmonization and some sort of a regulatory framework. And then everyone's sort of talking about the burden on these smaller local organizations to combat misinformation and disinformation. So I'm curious what that looks like, given that some of these firms are U.S. based, some are in China. There may be others that pop up in other countries. So what's an effective regulatory or otherwise sort of framework to actually effectively combat this? Because at the end of the day, it has to be something at scale. So is it something international, or is it going through individual countries? So for example, if in the US, a regulatory framework is enacted for companies that are US based, such as Facebook and Twitter, does that then apply to what they do in other countries? Is that a better route, or is it something else?
Thank you so much, Sarah. So I'm going to just briefly turn it back to the panel to allow them to jump in on these questions and comments and reflections, and to just briefly add two of my own, but put them at the bottom of the list if time runs out. And Nicholas, can I just check? We're over at 12:30 or 12:45? 12:30, perfect. So this is gonna be a lightning response round, but just two to put out there. One, to come back to the question that Claire raised and to put it to the other panel members in terms of, and to those in the room, of this values contestation that is happening within the tech community. Where could peace-building practices and knowledge come in to perhaps help navigate that? And Eleanor, I know the work that you've done on deliberative quality, and maybe you could just say a little bit about that as one possible approach for navigating a values contestation. And then just in terms of peace-building values and approaches and what they might be able to introduce to technology to flip that direction again. Of course, we do a lot on participatory approaches and what an inclusive approach looks like. So when it comes to building either international regulatory framework, or regional one, or a national one, do we have the right constellation of individuals involved in those conversations to make sure they're representative? And particularly I'm thinking of generational elements of who is making the policy versus who understands the technology or understands the context that technology is going to affect. So I'll pause there, and I'll go in reverse order this time. So Ivy, over to you. Any of those comments or questions that you might want to reflect on, maybe picking one or two, just so that we can move through each of the panelists before the conclusion of the session.
I mean, it will be quick. I had such a hard time listening to the questions, I think, because they were very far. But I mean, this is just to say quickly, like the peace-building organizations, just in my own opinion, I think it will be interesting to try and promote maybe from the local population themselves. So I know there's a lot of like partnerships with governments, but it will be interesting to see peace-building organizations going to also the local organizations, see what they can come up with, and just try to push like how maybe develop some tools from the people who know better, and to try to combat the misinformation, disinformation. But again, I might be answering a very wrong question because I had a hard time listening to you, but that's it.
No, thank you. I know it's hard when you haven't heard the room full of comments and questions, but thank you for coming in with that. We should have been passing the microphone around. Claire, over to you for any reflections, responses you might.
It's hard even being in the room because there was there were myriad points brought up. I guess as I'm listening to all of you, what becomes apparent to me, so I heard these questions of scale, questions of the burden. I thought that was really meaningful on local communities. And I think something I have been realizing, so I think something that gets lost in the AI governance conversation or AI regulation conversation is the extent to which most of the regulations that are broadly around AI are focused on transparency or auditing. They're not actually focused on some articulation of like alleviating this values conflict for what we want. So that's like a first interesting observation. And what I actually encourage a lot of people to do who are so focused on, and the OECD is doing meaningful work in AI governance. There are multilateral bodies that are doing work, the UN, et cetera, not enforceable yet, but the EU AI Act. But what gets lost actually, and I believe will be more impactful, are questions around in the courts in the US, which will dictate behavior and operating systems, I think, at a lot of the large technology companies, which I would argue have, for worse, not for better, have undue influence on the amplification of this content. Section 230 in the US, which is ostensibly about speech considerations and whether or not platforms should be treated as publishers for liability, that's in the Supreme Court right now. And I know this may sound very US-centric, but it's the first time there's really been any legal reckoning about what algorithmic amplification is. So I do not see a world where the whole world is going to agree on what is misinforming and what isn't. It's interesting to me that some of the countries that have been most emphatic about AI regulation are also those that we might roll our eyes at as most authoritarian. That's interesting that the US people in the US are looking to China or Singapore or other countries for guidance on AI regulation that might implicate speech. I find that, tell me if you find that interesting. But to me, the real question is, how do we thwart algorithmic amplification of content? Because in the absence of perfect agreement, there are ways for these systems to not optimize purely for engagement, so that surprise isn't the thing that gets something shared. There are ways to add friction in design that allow for that, so that you might encourage people to not share based on surprise. And I guess it's somewhat the pragmatist in me, even though I was at a conference on algorithmic amplification last week with lots of computer scientists who said the definition compares amplification to a neutral baseline, of which that's very hard to delineate what a neutral baseline is for an algorithm. But I think, to me, if I wanted to address the scale concern, I would first say to the companies, stop optimizing for engagement. You know, incendiary content goes this way. That allows us to not rejigger the labeling. And I have a hypothesis that even in the absence of large language models for other regions and claim matching for other regions, that would slow down the pace of problematic content. And of course, it would slow down the pace perhaps of a lot of positive or pro-social content, but perhaps that's a trade-off that we might be willing to make. So I know that's kind of a grand theory. I'm testing it out with this group, but it's derived from, I think, the levers around algorithmic amplification are some of the most meaningful for affecting right now the changes that you all were bringing up.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for that. And Eleanor, in the 3 minutes we have remaining, reflections, responses.
Okay, thank you very much. I actually wanted to address the regulation question too, maybe from a different perspective. I think what you said, Claire, is very interesting. The whole multi-stakeholderism discussion in the digital space is being discussed a lot in a global context and at the UN. Generally, there's these global conventions that are multilateral, so only member states, UN member states, sign on to them. So the idea here is that the member states sign on. They're not directly, they won't be, fined by the UN if they don't follow them, but they are responsible after signing, supposedly, to then enact the global conventions in their own countries, and they'll start developing frameworks and regulations. And so that's kind of the old model of global governance. One of the challenges now is that, as have been mentioned, a lot of the private sector companies operate across different jurisdictions. And so one of the efforts now is to think about multi-stakeholderism, which is not just countries, but also private sector and civil society organizations together, where private sector companies could also sign these agreements. When they operate under national jurisdiction, of course, they have to follow the law. But at the same time, they could make the commit themselves so that when they're in a country where those regulations are not implemented, they would still follow those regulations. And so that would be a framework in which we could have the fastest adoption of a framework for to fight misinformation. But of course, there needs to be a lot of deliberation and discussion on the best way to do it, and that always takes some time. Another quick point that I wanted to make is really based on the funding element, which I think is really relevant for CSOs. I'm Canadian and from Montreal. Montreal is a new hub for AI, and the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent by the government for the private sector there and to bring in American companies to Montreal is just amazing. There has been no investment in civil society organizations that could also develop their own AI expertise and do things for social good. And so I think that there's a real intentionality here of making sure that funding goes to organizations that can really address this. And similarly, we talked about, I think someone mentioned how, social media companies have been struggling to moderate misinformation content online. I really don't think it's a question of struggling. I think it's a question of no resources whatsoever. A lot of countries have one content moderator or like a small team of 5 people that also have to moderate content in languages that they don't speak. It's a question of capacity. And so, you know, I don't think it's a struggle. I think it's because no effort has been put into it. So that means that there's a lot of opportunities, I think, to address this at different levels. And so those are my final thoughts on this.
Thank you, Eleanor. Just to briefly conclude with 2 quick plugs, I understand that the Alliance for Peacebuilding has a Tech and Peace working group. Maybe many of you are already a part of it, but if not, it's a space to continue this conversation. That's something to just take note of. And then to say to make sure that in as many chances as we can to continue the conversation across these sectors, there's a number of different conferences and venues, but just to name one, there's an annual conference in Geneva called AI for Good. It's put on by ITU. You have to sign up based on the sector you're coming from. Currently, there's nothing related to peace or conflict or anything. So a few of us are going this year. If you can make it, I know it's in Geneva, maybe they have a hybrid element. The more of us that can start to blend these conversations and bring these perspectives in, hopefully the easier it will be to continue these discussions productively. So otherwise, just to thank all of you for your time in joining today. I know we didn't get to a lot of the questions and comments, but I hope those can continue in the corridors or over lunch. And to really thank my panelists today for coming and sharing their expertise and their thoughts with the room. So thank you again.